Some sermons last minutes, others cross centuries. East coast of China, mid-1930s. A thin man slowly steps up to the pulpit. His curved shoulders betray the weakness of his body, marks of vigils, illnesses, and growing opposition. But in his eyes, something shines, a fire not born of earth. Watchman Nee opens the Bible. The hall is packed, the air thick, stifling. Civil war echoes outside, communism spreading like a shadow. He takes a deep breath and begins. For 3 hours, without speaking of himself, he proclaims Christ. He doesn't mention his pain. He mentions neither persecutions nor scars. He speaks only of the cross, of surrender, of the life that conquers death. His voice is gentle, but each word falls like a hammer upon the listeners' hearts. There was no music, there were no shouts. But at the end, hundreds of men and women fell to their knees, weeping, confessing sins, surrendering ministries, renouncing positions. That night, a movement was sealed. Out of that sermon would be born the local church, a revival that would resist persecution and cross borders. It was the hidden Pentecost of modern China, but no one there imagined that the man speaking about dying to the world would one day indeed die for love of Christ in such a cruel way. But before we continue, tell us where you're watching from. And if this story makes your heart burn, subscribe now. Because the same fire that fell that night still seeks hearts willing to burn. She prayed before the open window. The morning air carried the damp smell of the river, and the distant sound of bells called people to another ordinary day. But for that woman, there was nothing ordinary about that dawn. Lin He-ping knelt on the wooden floor, placed her hands on her womb, and made a vow that heaven recorded in silence. Lord, if you give me a son, may he belong completely to you. May his life not be his own, but yours. And when the boy was born in Shantou, she called him Ni Shu Tzu. The world would know him decades later as Watchman Nee, the Sentinel. But in that beginning, he was just a curious boy with bright eyes and a restless soul. His father, a respected official, dreamed his son would pursue a government career, but his mother saw something different, a strange brightness, a restlessness that didn't belong to this world. In his youth, Nee became intelligent, determined, and proud. He believed in discipline, not in faith. He considered his mother's prayers a waste of time. He said religion was the crutch of the weak, until in April 1920, at 17 years old, he entered a small hall to attend evangelistic meetings led by Dora Yu, at first to mock. The meeting was simple. A preacher with a calm voice spoke about the blood of Christ, about repentance, about a love that demands everything. Nee listened only out of courtesy, or perhaps curiosity. But suddenly, one phrase struck him like an arrow. The Lamb was slain for you. He couldn't explain what he felt. It was as if a mirror shattered inside him. He left the hall disturbed, walked through empty streets to his room. There, alone, he fell to his knees. Lord Jesus, you have won. From this day forward, I will be yours. When day broke, something was different. There was no enthusiasm, only peace. The same peace his mother had always had in her eyes. In that moment, a story began that would change the faith of a nation. The conversion was total. Nee became a student of the scriptures. He read the Bible like a man listening, and wrote down each verse like one receiving instructions from an invisible commander. He spent nights awake, sometimes on his knees, until his body gave out. He said prayer was the place where man surrenders before even fighting. In a short time, he began to preach. Not from pulpits, but on street corners, in homes, in makeshift halls. He spoke with a serenity that made people cry without understanding why. He didn't offer easy promises. He offered a cross. One day, he wrote in his notebook, "The Christian is someone who has already died and now lives only for what is eternal." God led him down narrow paths. In the midst of fervent youth, Nee fell in love. She was a godly girl, sweet, the kind of love that seemed like heaven's approval. But in prayer he felt the Spirit say, "This is not the way," and with tears he obeyed. Later he wrote, "Obedience is the altar where God kindles his flame." At 19 he began gathering young people to study the Bible. There were no titles, no leaders, only brothers. Fellowship was the temple, Christ the center. There the seed was born of what years later would be known as the local church. It was during this time that he met Margaret Barber, an English missionary, severe but full of the Spirit. She tested him, confronted him, and often made him wait in silence, sometimes for hours, before speaking. Once, reading Philippians 3, she stopped and looked firmly into his eyes. To know Christ is to participate in his sufferings. Are you willing? He didn't answer with words, only wept. Later, he would write, God doesn't use full vessels. He first breaks them. And it was through breaking that Nee was being formed. People began to seek him out. They spoke of miracles, of conversions, of transformation. But he didn't accept praise. He always repeated, "There is nothing extraordinary about me. There is only a Christ who lives in me." In 1927, the movement expanded. Groups multiplied through villages and cities, without denominations, without hierarchy, only faith. Simple men preached, women led prayers, young people left their jobs to serve. It was a silent revival, but real. A new book of Acts, written in the dust of China. But the same fire that attracted multitudes also ignited opposition. Some Western missionaries accused him of rebellion. Other local Christians called him a fanatic. The government began to watch, but he didn't retreat. "I'd rather be misunderstood and remain faithful than be applauded and disobey." The pressures increased and his health began to fail. The long journeys, the dawns in prayer, the constant fasting, everything took its toll. But the more his body weakened, the more his voice seemed to gain authority. It was as if the Spirit spoke through the cracks of the vessel. In a letter from 1930, he wrote to a friend, "There are days when I don't feel strength even to preach. But when I open my mouth, he speaks. It's then that I realize, the servant is dying, but the Lord is alive." That same year, he made a radical decision. He sold almost all the books he owned, thousands of volumes, and distributed the money to those in need. He kept only a Bible, a notebook, and a pen. The cross is the place where my will dies and his lives. Houses became churches, tables became altars, broken bread a symbol of fellowship and courage, and the name of Jesus began to echo where before there was silence. By 1932, he was known throughout the region. Men came from far away to hear the young man who spoke of Christ as if he had seen him, and perhaps he had. His gaze, they say, was of one who had already contemplated something the world cannot offer. But among the blessings, the whispers began. Communism was growing, censorship tightening, and Nee's name began appearing in official reports. He knew what that meant. Even so, he continued to travel, write, teach. One dawn, praying alone, he felt a different weight. It wasn't fear, it was a forewarning. He picked up his notebook and wrote only one line, "The watchman must keep vigil, even when the enemy is already inside the walls." Those words would be remembered years later, because the enemy had already arrived, and the flame that burned over China would soon be surrounded by darkness. But that night, before lying down, he did what he always did. He bent his knees, took a deep breath, and said softly, "Lord, may I not deny you, not even in silence." The lamp flickered, and the shadow of the room seemed to bow. The clock struck 3 in the morning. The watchman remained on guard. The year was 1949. China was in turmoil. The sound of military boots echoed in the streets. Red flags fluttered, and the name of Christ began to be whispered with fear. The new communist regime prohibited independent religious gatherings. Pastors were arrested, temples confiscated, books burned. The government declared there cannot be two masters in China. Watchman Nee knew what that meant. He had preached that the true Lord is invisible, and that made him dangerous. The faith that united hearts was now seen as a threat to the state. In the first months, the local church movement suffered brutal pressures. Thousands of believers were interrogated. Some, terrified, denied his name to save their own lives. Others disappeared. But many remained, gathering in basements, caves, and abandoned houses, singing softly with tears. Nee, already sick, continued preaching in secret. His letters circulated hidden, passed from hand to hand like sacred contraband. "Christ lives in us," he repeated, "and as long as he lives, the church will never die." But the pressure increased. In 1952, his door was broken down before dawn. Armed men invaded, searched everything, papers, notebooks, letters. Everything was taken. He remained seated, silent, staring fixedly at a small cross on the table. He didn't resist, didn't argue, didn't beg. He only closed his eyes and whispered, "Lord, what comes now belongs to you." He was taken under escort, without handcuffs, his body frail, his countenance peaceful. Witnesses say he left his house smiling. Someone asked, "Watchman, where are they taking you?" And he answered, "Wherever the Lord goes with me." In the following days, newspapers called him an enemy of the people. The regime accused him of espionage, treason, and religious subversion. Nothing was proven, but the sentence was already written. 20 years of forced labor. The cell was damp, dark, without windows. During the first months, he was forced to carry stones under the sun, then sew sandbags. The guards mocked him, called him the mute preacher, but what hurt him most wasn't the insults, it was the silence. No Bible, no letters, no brothers nearby. He began to pray in thought, in whispers, without voice, without words, only breath. He wrote on a piece of cloth, "Even if I cannot preach, I can love. Even if I cannot speak, I can pray." The following years were a slow crucifixion. His body bent, his eyes lost brightness, but his spirit grew. The other prisoners noticed something different. He never got angry, never fought back. When he was beaten, he thanked softly. When they gave him the worst bread, he shared it. A guard said later, "That man didn't resist. He surrendered. But his surrender made us uneasy." Once, an officer decided to humiliate him before everyone. He ordered him to kneel and renounce the faith. Nee remained standing, silent. The soldier shouted, struck, tore his shirt and asked, "Why don't you speak?" He answered with a hoarse voice, "Because I already gave up my life before you asked for it." The news spread among the prisoners, the preacher who forgave. Some began to seek him at night asking for prayer. Others converted inside the camp. The revival the government tried to extinguish began there in the shadows. Meanwhile, on the outside, the local church grew, without pastors, without leaders, without temples. The people gathered at dawn, guided by the old letters he had left. Some were hidden in clothing linings, others buried in iron chests. Faith spread like flame in a contrary wind. Inside the prison, Nee was a man between two worlds. On the outside, a prisoner. On the inside, free. When they let him write work reports, he used the margins to record verses. When they gave him scraps of paper, he wrote short phrases and hid them in the clothes of those who left. Some of those words crossed borders and, years later, would be published in books that would change the world. In 1956, he was transferred to a more severe prison where human contact was forbidden. That was the beginning of a time of absolute silence. For years, no one heard his voice. His wife died without being able to see him, the disciples were scattered, and the world began to forget him. But heaven did not. The Spirit sustained him in the darkness. He transformed each breath into prayer. And when his mind nearly gave in, he repeated softly what he had written years before. The Lord doesn't call us to understand. He calls us to obey. From time to time, a younger guard approached him in secret. He would ask, "Tell me about your God." And he would answer simply, "He is real, even here." Some of those guards, years later, would testify, "I entered to break him, but I left believing." In the 1960s, the government prohibited any mention of Watchman Nee's name. His books were burned, his sermons censored, but in the underground churches, the name was whispered in prayer. People said, "Our brother is still there, and the same Spirit is still here." Illness consumed him slowly. Heart problems, joint issues, constant fevers. But when a doctor asked how he endured, he answered, "The body is weak, but the Christ in me is sufficient." In 1970, he completed 18 years of imprisonment. He was unrecognizable, but still standing. The few who saw him said his face looked like someone who no longer lived for this world. In the last official record, dated 1972, only calm behavior was mentioned, without incidents. But those who knew him understood that, behind that silence, the revival continued. The clandestine churches multiplied, his books had already crossed the ocean, and foreign missionaries copied his phrases in hidden notebooks. In the prison, the watchman remained, no longer with voice, but with life, no longer with crowds, but with Christ. The empire called him a traitor, but heaven called him a witness. And without the guards realizing it, the flame he had kindled outside the walls now burned inside them. Winter arrived heavy in 1971. The cold air of Anhui pierced through the stone walls. The floor covered with ice reflected the glow of the lamps, and inside his cell, time seemed to have stopped. Watchman Nee, thin, shoulders bent, breathed with difficulty. They called him the mute preacher. But that silence for him was just another kind of prayer. The regime believed they had defeated him. No sermons, no letters, no audience, only darkness. But heaven never needed microphones. From within the walls, God began to write a story that no one could censure. The guards sometimes watched him with curiosity. At night, they heard murmurs coming from the cell. It was the sound of a song, almost inaudible, hummed through trembling teeth. Fragments of hymns, old memories from the time when the church gathered freely. One of the guards mocked, "Why do you still sing, old man? No one hears you." Nee smiled and answered softly, "But he hears." Outside, the communist empire reinforced the silence. Thousands of Christians were imprisoned, others hidden in farms, mines, caves. Even so, the gospel continued to spread, not by voice, but by witness. Old letters written by Nee before prison began to reappear like fragments of light. Reports tell of writings preserved discreetly in linings, objects, and hiding places that later came to light. And each phrase seemed to carry the fragrance of eternity. Faith is not the absence of pain. It is the certainty that Christ still reigns within it. Obedience doesn't free us from the cross. It only brings us closer to God. These words began to cross borders. They reached Hong Kong, then Europe, and finally America. Missionaries, without knowing if he was still alive, translated his texts in secret. And while the name Watchman Nee was being erased from China, the same name began to be spoken from pulpits in the West. His books were copied by hand, distributed from house to house, and read with tears. Without knowing it, the forgotten man in a cell was becoming a teacher of nations. Inside the prison, the body was already giving in. The cold made him shiver. The fever made him delirious. But when they gave him old, hard bread, he broke it and gave thanks. When they humiliated him, he prayed for those who hurt him. One of the guards, years later, would say, "That man didn't fight, he surrendered." But his surrender made us afraid. One night, a younger soldier, troubled, asked, "Why did your God leave you here?" Nee answered with a tired but firm voice, "To show that he is still here." That answer spread through the prison like wind on dry straw. And little by little, the guards began to change. Some asked for prayer. Others called him wise old man, and every time he said, "God bless you," it was as if the air inside the walls became lighter. In 1972, the body no longer obeyed. One of the guards, the same one who had called him crazy, saw him smiling and asked, "Why do you laugh?" He answered, "Because I'm about to go home." The next morning, they found him lying down, his head turned toward the window. Beside him, according to the account preserved by family members, there was a small folded piece of paper with firm letters. "Christ is the Son of God who died for me and rose again. This is the greatest truth in the universe. I die for my faith in Christ. Watchman Nee." The guard stood motionless. For a moment, there was no ideology, no slogans, no human force. The cell seemed filled with a peace he couldn't explain. He kept the note hidden, and years later delivered it to the family. The news didn't appear in newspapers. There was no funeral, no cross was raised. But that same month, thousands of Christians gathered in silence throughout China, thanking God for the life of a man who had disappeared, and yet remained present. The government believed the flame had been extinguished, but the fire was already spreading. Today, scholars estimate that around 100 million Chinese Christians trace their roots to the faith he planted. Simple men and women, without temples, without pulpits, without freedom, but filled with the same spirit that sustained the watchman. And that guard who found the note would testify later, "He died silent, but left something I could never forget. The air in that cell was different." Perhaps that's what the world never understood. You can imprison a body, but you cannot handcuff a surrendered heart. You can erase a name, but not the life that burns within. Because the Christ who dwelt in Watchman Nee was never imprisoned. If you're hearing this now, know, the same God who sustained a man in a cold cell is the same one who still kindles hearts in the darkest places. And perhaps someone you know needs to hear this truth. Share this video with those who are tired, imprisoned, forgotten, because the fire that sustained the watchman still seeks an altar to rekindle. The world forgot him, but heaven did not. And the echo of his surrender still crosses time, as if each word of his still says, "Christ lives." But what happened after his death may be the most impressive miracle of all. And that's what you'll hear now. The body was buried without a name, but heaven knew who he was. Watchman Nee left no heirs, no monuments, only traces of light. And it was through these traces that God guided the steps of an entire generation. Years passed. The dust of history covered the cell where he died. The documents disappeared, and the government tried to erase even the memory. But in the early hours across China, the prayers began to reappear, gentle as wind over ashes. In basements, in fields, in factories, men and women began to gather again, without name, without sign, without visible leader, and yet the same spirit. They didn't have written sermons, only memories. And when someone asked, "How do we keep the faith when everything is forbidden?" the answers came in silence. A torn Bible, a whispered song, a tear over broken bread. It was as if God himself said, "I am still here, because a man many years ago believed that I was enough." Nee's words began to circulate again, first in illegal copies, then in books that crossed oceans. His reflections on the cross, the inner life, spiritual authority, transformed hearts in places where he never set foot. Preachers in America, in Africa, in Europe, all quoted that Chinese name that time tried to bury. But he never wanted them to remember him. He wanted them to remember the one who never left him. Today, there are millions of Christians in underground China. They don't know freedom, but they know Christ. They have no temples, but they have fellowship. They have no famous leaders, but they have the same fire that once burned in the soul of an imprisoned man. And that's why Watchman Nee's legacy is so powerful, because it didn't depend on visibility, but on faithfulness. His writings still whisper to those who doubt. When God is silent, it's because he's teaching the heart to hear him in another way. Obedience is deeper than success. The altar remains the place where the impossible happens. Each line is an ember, and each ember, when touched, reignites someone who thought the fire had already gone out. Many years later, a researcher visited the prison where Nee had died. The walls were stained with rust, the cell empty. But the man recounted that, upon entering, he felt something he couldn't describe. It was as if the air was still impregnated with prayer. He said, "I don't know what happened here, but something survived time." Yes, what survives time is what was planted in eternity. His name became a symbol of perseverance, not because of courage, but because of trust. Courage faces fear, trust transcends it. And that's what he left us, an invisible map to survive when everything seems lost. Today, when free churches sing, there is something of Nee's song in them. When someone kneels to pray, there is something of his surrender in that posture. When a Christian forgives, there is something of his Christ in that gesture. His body was erased from the earth, but the echo of his faith still reverberates in heaven. And perhaps that's why God still chooses stories like this, not to celebrate martyrs, but to remember that the kingdom never depended on strength nor on fame. The kingdom is silent, but it is invincible. And before we close, if this story spoke to you, write in the comments something simple but true. Perhaps just, "Lord, revive us." Words like these are seeds, and sometimes a single phrase can rekindle the faith of someone who was already thinking of giving up. And if this channel has been for you more than just content, if it has been refuge, prayer, and nourishment on silent days, then consider sustaining this flame with your gesture. Click on Super Thanks below and help us sustain this mission. There are stories that need to continue being told. Stories of real faith, of silent surrender, of a God who still moves among the weary. Your support is what allows them to keep reaching those who need to hear them most. And if you cannot contribute, do something even more powerful. Pray. Pray that the fire that sustained Watchman Nee crosses screens and borders. Pray that the next stories find willing hearts. Pray that the Spirit returns to blow upon the forgotten knees of the world. Before you leave, subscribe and watch the other videos on the channel. May the story of each hero of faith awaken you to be increasingly faithful. Because Watchman Nee's testimony reminds us of something eternal. God doesn't sustain those who seek comfort. He sustains those who remain faithful. May your weakness lead you to prayer. May your silence become a place of communion. And when the world seems dark, may you remember the light that shone in the cell of a man who died, saying only, "Christ lives. The fire is still burning." And perhaps now it's waiting for your yes.